Amedure podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Amedure podcast, we're going to talk about something a little bit different. This week, we're going to be talking about the murders that stemmed from a daytime talk show, The Jenny Jones Show. And I'm sure you're probably wondering how a daytime talk show and a murder have anything at all in common, but don't worry, I'm going to explain exactly how these two things correlate. But before I say let's get it, I have to congratulate two of my, most beloved and longtime listeners on their wedding. Because this part legitimately made me cry. They are actually both such big fans, and don't worry, I'm just as big a fans of them, that during their wedding ceremony, they had their ordained minister say, and without further ado, and that's when Lisa and her husband Lee both chime in and say, let's get it, before they start their wedding ceremony vows. And this is a true crime podcast, and since we do only get together to talk about, heinous and unspeakable acts of violence, I actually got the okay to play this short clip of Lisa and Lee starting off their wedding ceremony in the same way that I start off this podcast every single week. So I actually want to play everyone this short clip. I just figured this would be a nice way to start off this episode on a much lighter and happier note, and also be a way for me to publicly congratulate these two happily married people.
So as minister of this ceremony, I'm here to do just this. So without any further ado, please.
Let's get it.
You heard them, y'all. So let's get it. Now, if you grew up in the 90s like myself, then you know what the Jenny Jones Show is. And it was a part of the daytime talk show list that you got stuck watching when you were allowed to stay home from school during a weekday. Some other shows that would air before or after the Jenny Jones Show were shows like Judge Judy, Maury, Jerry Springer, and Montel Williams. Good God, I love me some Montel Williams. But while the Jenny Jones Show premiered in 1993, Jenny Jones herself was sort of like a jack of all trades. Because before she was ever approached by Warner Brothers to do the Jenny Jones Show, she was also a singer, a comedian, a drummer, and so much more. Jenny Jones herself would actually make guest appearances on other daytime talk shows before she got her own talk show. And just like how Maury didn't start out being a paternity test show to see who your baby daddy is, the Jenny Jones Show also didn't start out being this drama-filled, reveal your bigger secrets to the world kind of show either. Because the very first season of the Jenny Jones Show was actually more like a show where guests were brought in to sit down with Jenny Jones, and they would talk about issues that were prevalent at the time, and things of that sort. So the Jenny Jones Show actually started out kind of more like the Oprah Show or the Ricky Lake Show during the first season that it aired. But when the first season's ratings weren't high enough to keep the show afloat, during those peak daytime talk show time slots, the entire premise of the show was changed. From the second season, the Jenny Jones Show season 1 and season 2 were incredibly different from one another. The second season of the Jenny Jones Show did a lot more of the typical things that we've all come to expect from, trash daytime talk shows. Because the second season of the Jenny Jones Show did some, You Are Not the Father, paternity type things, and teenage makeovers were another big thing that the Jenny Jones Show focused on after changing the entire format of the show after the season 2 revamp. And something interesting that I learned while I was researching this case was that Wayne Newton was actually the one that discovered Jenny Jones, which isn't even her real name, by the way. But he discovered Jenny while she was on tour with her band in Las Vegas. And Jenny Jones was even featured on Star Search in 1986, and Star Search is kind of like America's Got Talent or something like that from my understanding. It featured different genres in the entertainment industry, like comedy, singing, dancing, etc. And Jenny Jones had actually won the comedy category in that, comedy genre, which came with a cash prize of $100,000. So this kind of helped jumpstart her career. Because I had always been so curious, how does somebody get their own talk show? You have to be at least a little bit famous already, right? They're not just handing out talk shows to your average Joe. So this makes sense as to why Warner Brothers reached out to Jenny Jones and as to how the Jenny Jones Show came about. Now, back to the second season of the Jenny Jones show, because after the show was revamped and remastered for season 2, this show took a more common everyday life kind of approach. The show focused more on normal people sharing their things from their normal day-to-day lives. And we all know this makes for the best trash TV. The makeover segments that the Jenny Jones show would do would be like a mom, pleading with Jenny Jones to give her gothic teenager a makeover. Or, there were shows that focused on someone who used to be super skinny and nerdy and now they're buff and muscular and fit or whatever. And I may be misremembering the titles of these, but I swear I can vividly remember shows on the Jenny Jones show that were tagged with string bean to buff machine or something like that. I distinctly remember watching a few episodes. One about girls with huge breasts and how they dress and how they live day-to-day life. There were other topics like men who fall in love with women in prison and overbearing in-laws, just stuff that's made for good trash reality talk show in the 90s. Because this was a very different time. 99% of these topics on these shows would not fly today whatsoever. And the Jenny Jones show kind of reminds me of if the Steve Wilkos show and the Ricky Lake show had a TV show love child. That's what the Jenny Jones show would be. And everybody was tuning in. The Jenny Jones show was one of the most highly rated talk shows of the 90s, and the show itself won several different awards. But with anything good, there has to come some bad, and over time, some viewers of the show were concerned that the guests that were being brought onto the Jenny Jones show were being exploited or just flat out humiliated. For example, the teen makeover segments. Those teenagers didn't actually want a makeover. It was more like their parents didn't like the way they dressed or the way they styled their hair, and they kind of forced them onto the Jenny Jones show to do these makeovers. Another segment that would eventually lead to murder was the secret crush segment. Because during the episodes of revealing a secret crush, a viewer would write into the Jenny Jones show explaining that they had a crush on someone that they knew. This viewer would explain who their crush was, why they liked this person, and so on and so forth. And then the viewer that wrote into the show saying that they had a crush would be brought onto the show along with their secret crush. Except only the person who wrote into the show knew why they were being asked to come onto the show at all. So whoever the person was that was being crushed on, that person never had any idea why they were actually being brought onto the show. They were essentially being lied to just to be able to get them onto the show without them finding out why. And then once both parties arrive to the show, the crush finds out in front of an entire live audience and the majority of America watching who has a crush on them and why they were really asked to be on the show to start with. They were basically blindsided with this information about who had a crush on them. So whoever had the crush would be brought on stage first. They would explain to the audience who they had a crush on, why they liked that person, what they liked about them. And then the crush would be brought on stage with them and told by that person that, they have a crush on them. And this segment was oftentimes referred to as an ambush segment, just because there is no right or wrong way to reacting to finding out this information in front of a live audience on national TV with cameras in your face. There is no wrong or right way to react to finding out that somebody has a crush on you with all those circumstances combined. And then after the crush was revealed, the hope would be that the two would go on and I guess live happily ever after. I don't know. This is actually the definition of an ambush, so that makes sense as to why they would call these ambush segments. And in 1995, Scott Amedure, who was 32 at the time, he wrote into the Jenny Jones show in hopes to make it onto one of the show's secret crush segments. Because Scott was a really big fan of the Jenny Jones show, and he thought it would be a fun idea to write into the show to reveal a secret crush that Scott had been hiding from someone that he knew. But before we go any further into the Jenny Jones show and what happened next, let's kind of go back and see who Scott Amedure was as a person. Scott Amedure was born in 1963 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to his parents, Frank and Patricia Amedure. Scott was one of 5 kids, which consisted of 4 boys and 1 girl. So Scott had 3 brothers and a sister, which sounds like so many siblings, but I did see that after Scott's parents were divorced when he was about 5 years old, that Scott's dad was granted full custody of the kids and they primarily lived with their dad. When Scott was 17 years old, he dropped out of high school and enlisted in the U.S. Army. Scott loved serving in the Army and he specialized in satellite communications, which he was really good at. Scott was so good at his job that he climbed ranks pretty quickly. Scott did finish up the things that he needed to do as far as what he had left from high school so that he could get his GED. And he did all of this while he was enlisted. So not only was he serving in the Army, but he was also like, let me make sure I get my GED while I'm here, which we love that. But after serving in the Army for 3 years, Scott was honorably discharged from the Army due to a leg injury. And after he was honorably discharged, Scott was able to find work outside of the Army in the satellite communication field. But after a little while of this, Scott decided to pick up some extra shifts as a bartender at night. Scott liked the social interaction of people once the sun went down and the traffic to and from work was easier. He said he just preferred to work at nighttime. So bartending seems like something that would have been right up Scott's alley, and he fit right in at his bartending gig. He was able to socialize with his patrons, and he quickly made new friends, and this just seemed like the perfect job for Scott. Scott was said to have been the life of every party, and that he was always a good time. Scott also identified as gay, and at this time, he was just out here living his best life. Scott was such a big-hearted person and just genuinely a good soul that a lot of Scott's friends at the time had been diagnosed with the AIDS virus. And when those friends were put out of their houses or when their families would turn their backs on them, Scott was always there for them, no questions asked. Scott would take anyone in and help anyone that he could, and he was always willing to lend a helping hand. If one of his friends came out as gay and they were kicked out of their living situations, or if their family disowned them, Scott would take them in and make sure that they had somewhere to lay their heads. And Scott was the same way with the friends that had been diagnosed with the AIDS virus. So this would have been in the 70s and 80s. And back then, people heard the word AIDS and they automatically went into a panicked frenzy. But it was a real pandemic at the time. And Scott was just always one of those friends that you knew you could count on. You didn't have to question whether or not Scott had your back or not. You just knew that he did. So who did Scott have a crush on and how did they meet? So, like I said, Scott was a big fan of the Jenny Jones show and he worked as a bartender at night, so he was usually awake to able to watch the episodes of the Jenny Jones show when they aired throughout the daytime. Scott had been living in a mobile home in Lake Orion, Michigan, and one afternoon Scott was going to go to his brother's apartment and hang out. And as Scott was leaving the apartment complex, he ran into one of his friends, Donna, who just happened to live in the same complex. And Donna was outside standing next to her car with another man who was working under her car. Scott walked over, he greeted Donna, and this is when Donna introduced Scott to her friend Jonathan Smits. And Jonathan Smits had been the friend who was helping Donna work on her car. Jonathan was 24 years old, and he was handsome and obviously good with his hands, because you gotta be good with your hands in order to work on cars. So Scott was immediately attracted to Jonathan, and thus the secret crush began. And when Scott expressed that he had a crush on Jonathan to Donna, she told Scott that she didn't think that Jonathan was gay, but Donna did say that she remembered Jonathan telling her something about the fact that his family had questioned him about his sexuality and about the fact of whether or not he was gay or not before. But Jonathan had also been engaged to a woman before, and it had just not ended up working out between the two. So Donna said that she didn't think that Scott was gay, but she could be wrong. Which, that's fair, I guess. But Scott just thought that Jonathan was the most handsome, hunky thing, and he wanted to get to know him better, find out more about him, and, maybe shoot his shot. So when Scott saw the Secret Crush segment on the Jenny Jones show, he thought this was perfect. This would be a funny, lighthearted, dramatic way to see if Jonathan was into him or not. And I honestly think in Scott's mind that this was going to be harmless. Either Jonathan was gay and Scott had at least tried to go for it, and, maybe the two had a chance of getting to know each other better and maybe even being in a relationship. Or Jonathan wasn't gay at all, and this would be a fun trip with good food and free travel, and maybe it would be something that they could laugh about later on. I don't think that Scott wrote into the Jenny Jones show with any other expectations other than just to be given a chance to shoot his shot at Jonathan and see if it paid off. And this is something that I would have totally done when I was single 100 years ago, because even if my crush didn't reciprocate the same feelings, this would have been the most fun way to go about it. For me, anyways. And like I said, the food, the clothes, the travel expenses, they would have all been taken care of by the show if I'm not mistaken. So, like, why not? Go big or go home, and Scott was going big. So, after Scott reached out to the show, it was set. The show was scheduled to tape on May 6th in 1995, and Scott was even able to take Donna along with him as kind of like his wingman, his emotional support, whatever. So, Scott and Donna flew into Chicago together where the Jenny Jones show was taped. And Jonathan took his flight separately from Scott and Donna, but again, Jonathan has no idea that his secret crush is Scott. Now, Jonathan does know that he's going to be on the Jenny Jones show for someone to reveal that they have a secret crush on him, but Jonathan doesn't know that it's another man who has a crush on him, and he definitely doesn't know that it was Scott. Jonathan basically doesn't know anything except that someone has a crush on him and that it's someone that he knows. So the producers of the show, from my understanding, kind of made it sound like maybe his crush was Jonathan's ex-fiancé. And this is kind of what I mean when I say that these, segments like this were a total ambush. Scott was excited to reveal his crush on Jonathan, and he probably figured that the worst thing that would happen would be that Jonathan either isn't gay at all, or that he is gay and he's just not into Scott. Either way, no big deal. Except it was kind of a big deal because later we find out that Jonathan came from an extremely homophobic family. But let's get back to the show. So Scott and Donna flew into Chicago, and they were both told that the show would worry about getting Jonathan to show up. So the show basically told Scott and Donna, don't worry about it. We'll figure out a way to get Jonathan here so that you can reveal your crush. All you gotta do is show up. And that's exactly what they did. The show got Jonathan to fly out to Chicago too, just in a separate flight from Scott and Donna, like I mentioned. And like I said, Jonathan did know that someone was going to be revealing to him that they had a crush on him, but he was kind of assuming that it was his ex-fiancé. So the taping for the show starts, and Jenny Jones brings out Scott and Donna onto the stage in front of her live audience. Jenny Jones explains to the audience that this episode for the day was going to be uncovering a secret crush that was going to be revealed, and she introduces Scott and Donna to the audience. Jenny Jones asks a little bit about Scott, and then Jenny asks Scott to explain to the audience what he likes about Jonathan and how he met Jonathan and those kinds of things. And Scott basically tells the audience that he thinks Jonathan is just so hot, and Scott even goes a little bit into some of the fantasies that he has about Jonathan. But Jenny Jones pushes a little further, and she asks Scott to elaborate a little bit more on these fantasies that he's been having about Jonathan. So Scott does. He tells the audience that his fantasy involves himself and Jonathan and a hammock with some strawberries and whipped cream and champagne. Maybe a little tying somebody up, which that all sounds fun. But you get the idea of where he's going. So even during this little snippet of Scott detailing his fantasy, he's still doing it in a very playful, funny way. You can just tell that he's there to have a good time and shoot his shot. And meanwhile, Jonathan is behind the scenes with noise-canceling headphones on, so Jonathan has no idea about what's being said in front of the audience, and he still doesn't know who it is that has a crush on him. So, of course, after Scott, tells about this fantasy, this is the perfect time for Jenny Jones to suggest that they bring out Jonathan on the stage. It's finally time for Scott to reveal that he has a major crush on Jonathan. So Jonathan takes off the noise-canceling headphones and he walks out on stage. And he's still all smiles at this point. Jonathan walks over and he hugs Donna and he gives her a peck on the cheek. And then right before Jonathan goes to give Scott a hug, Jenny Jones says something to the effect of, "So did you think it was Donna that had a crush on you? You didn't realize it was Scott." And when she says this, you can see a little bit of a shift change in Jonathan. He's still smiling and he still gives Scott a hug. But you can see that it's a little bit of an uncomfortable moment while the two men give each other a quick hug and then Jonathan sits down. So this is just me speculating that Jonathan probably thought when he first walked out on the stage that Donna was the one who had a crush on him. And I say that just because of the way that Jonathan's face changed once Jenny Jones chimed in and said "Oh, you didn't realize it was Scott that had a crush on you." Again, this is just me speculating, but that is kind of what it seems like. Like, Jonathan maybe thought at first for a few seconds on stage that Donna was the one with a crush on him. But when he's asked about, thinking it was Donna, he even says, like, no, we're really good friends. Like, I kind of didn't think it was her. So, like I said, Jonathan was all smile still. He still hugs Scott to greet him. And it's like you can barely notice a change in Jonathan's demeanor. It was very, very, very slight, but it was there. Jonathan didn't seem angry, though, or, like, flabbergasted by anything. I mean, you can kind of see that he's a little bit uncomfortable. But then again, how's he supposed to react? There are cameras in his face and a live audience. So, for the most part, it seems like Jonathan is being a good sport. Like, he's uncomfortable, but he's not, like, irate pissed or anything. And the way that the three are sitting on stage, from left to right, it was Donna on the left, Scott in the middle, and Jonathan on the right. So, Scott and Jonathan are sitting right beside each other on stage, and as Jonathan is sitting down, he's laughing, and he looks at Scott and Donna both, and he just says, like, you guys lied to me. But he's still laughing. And I could not for the life of me figure out what that sentence was about when he says, like, you guys lied to me. Because Jonathan doesn't seem to be looking at Jenny Jones when he says that. It almost looks as if he's looking at Scott and Donna, and he's like, this is weird, you guys lied to me. Like, that's kind of bullshit. And the reason I say that it seems like he's looking at Scott and Donna and not at Jenny Jones is because the episode was never aired. There are only short clips from this episode that you can find online. So it's hard to tell when you're only getting like 1 3-second clip from one angle. But let's keep going. Because once the initial shock wears off, Jenny Jones has to figure out a way to bring the shock value right back up. We got to keep the ratings up, and this just wasn't enough. And what other way to do that than to replay the clip of Scott talking about how hot and hunky Jonathan is for Jonathan to watch. So Jenny Jones plays the clip for Jonathan of Scott talking about his hammock fantasy and about how cute and rock hard Jonathan's body is. And you can see that both Jonathan and Scott are both uncomfortable with this being played for Jonathan to watch. And my thinking with this is that Scott was so open about how cute he thought Jonathan was, and he was so open about sharing his fantasies because he thought that Jonathan was behind the scenes with noise-canceling headphones on, and that Jonathan probably wouldn't ever hear what he had to say. I really feel like Scott wouldn't have felt comfortable enough to say those things to Jonathan's face after he was brought out on stage. So he figured like it would be okay to share these things where Jonathan wouldn't be able to hear. Because I don't know if he would have said all those things had he known that Jenny Jones was going to play those clips back to Jonathan for him to watch. And after watching these clips, Jonathan covers his face with both of his hands, and he kind of throws his head back in laughter. And from watching these clips, if you don't know how this case ended, then you would probably be thinking to yourself like, wow, Jonathan handled that well and even laughed about it. But sadly, that is not how this secret crush reveal would end. So Jenny Jones goes on to ask Jonathan if he's single or dating someone, and Jonathan says that he is single and that he's flattered, but that he isn't gay. So this was essentially all the pieces and clips from the show that I could find. And then after the show wrapped up, we know that Jonathan, Scott, and Donna all went out to dinner together, and then all three of them flew back together on the plane, back home. They were all three together. So just knowing that they were able to sit down and have a meal together and then fly back home together, I feel like this could have easily just been a funny thing that they could all joke about later on during their friendship, like after the initial shock wore off. And like I said, Scott was the life of the party kind of guy, so why wouldn't he take someone on national TV to reveal his crush? And once Jonathan said that he wasn't interested and that he wasn't gay, it seems like they were at least attempting to just move past the whole thing. And also I do want to say that Jonathan seemed to be being a good sport about this whole thing. And I don't mean being a good sport because it was a gay man revealing his crush, but being a good sport as in being brought on national TV for a man, woman, gay, or straight to reveal a crush seems like it would either go really bad or really good. And just from watching these few clips that you can find, you would think that Jonathan was a good sport about the whole thing, and it seems to have went fine, because I know plenty of people who have had crushes on someone, and they tell them only to find out the other person doesn't feel the same way about them. They either usually end up never speaking to each other again, or they end up remaining friends and laugh about it later. And I wish that either one of those things would have happened here, but they didn't. Because once Scott, Donna, and Jonathan were all back home, and 3 days after the taping of the show, Jonathan walked out of his house to see a note that was taped to a construction light outside. The note said something along the lines of like, "You have all the right tools to turn this on," and Jonathan was sure that the note had come from Scott. Which, okay, that's clever, it's kind of funny, and if Jonathan didn't think it was funny, or if he was over this whole thing, he could have easily gone to Scott and just told him, like, we can be friends, but if you can't handle that without making these kinds of jokes and remarks, then we just don't need to be around each other at all. Or another option would be that Jonathan could have even gone through Donna and just asked Donna to, like, talk to Scott about making these kind of jokes and shit. That would have been a good option too. But Jonathan didn't handle it with either option. Because it was after finding this note that Jonathan says that he decided right then and there that instead of talking to Scott about the jokes and the note, that he was just going to kill Scott. Now, keep in mind that this note wasn't signed by Scott or anything like that, so at this point, there was no real proof that Scott was the one who wrote the note and left the note for Jonathan to find. It could have easily been someone in their hometown who heard about Scott taking Jonathan on the show, and maybe they thought this would be like a funny joke. So, like, at the time that Jonathan decided to kill Scott, there was nothing to, like, confidently conclude that Scott had been the one to write this note. So from here, Jonathan drives to the bank and withdraws a large sum of money. After the bank, Jonathan made another stop where he purchased a 12-gauge Buckeye shotgun along with the ammo that the gun would need in order to be fired. And I don't remember if I heard this somewhere or if I read it somewhere or if I just completely made this part up, but I swear I remember seeing or hearing someone say that Jonathan had even gone to 2 different stores, like one to buy the gun and one to buy the ammo. So saying that he basically bought the gun and the ammo at 2 separate stores, but don't hold me to that. And after Jonathan had everything that he would need in order to shoot a man to death, he drove over to Scott's mobile home where he sat outside for a little while, which this whole plan just screams premeditated murder to me. Pulling out the cash, making multiple stops, and then sitting outside of Scott's mobile home thinking about what you were about to go in and do. Yep, that's exactly what premeditation is defined as, but hey, what do I know? So, after Jonathan sits outside of Scott's house for a little while, he walks up to Scott's front door and he knocks, but Jonathan doesn't have the gun with him when he knocks on the door the first time. When Scott comes to the door, Jonathan confronts Scott and basically asks him if he had written the note and left it for him, and from my understanding, Scott didn't actually answer the question. He just kind of like smiled or smirked a little bit, which that's about the time that Jonathan walked back to his car, loaded the gun, and walked back to the front door of Scott's house. But this time when Scott opened the front door, he could see that Jonathan had a gun, and a pretty big and intimidating gun at that. So as Scott notices that Jonathan has a gun, Scott yells out to his roommate, kind of asking for help. But before Scott has time to get out the way, and before Scott's roommate has time to react, Jonathan shot Scott twice in the chest at point-blank range. And these 2 shots were actually at such close range that paperweighting from one of the shells was found in Scott's heart, and then there was fragments from the other bullet that were found in Scott's left lung. And I really only added that bit of information just to kind of articulate how close range these shots were made from. And there was also evidence that was found inside of Scott's mobile home that suggests that Scott did try to hold up a chair, in order to defend himself. But after the shots were fired, Jonathan immediately fled the scene in his own car and he headed straight for his sister's house. But on the way to his sister's house, Jonathan did something that we don't typically see in these kinds of cases. Because he stopped at a gas station to use the payphone on the way to his sister's house, and on this payphone he used it to call 911, where he essentially turned himself in. So while Jonathan is on the phone with 911, telling the dispatcher what happened and what he had just done, the dispatcher asked Jonathan why he shot someone, and Jonathan replied by saying, "The guy that I shot played a really awful trick on me." Now, obviously, Scott's roommate had also called 911 too, but it was too late for Scott once paramedics and ambulances arrived, and Scott was pronounced dead on the scene. The emergency services that responded to the scene also found the chair that was knocked over laying near Scott's body, which is why they believe that Scott likely tried to use the chair to protect himself. Meanwhile, at Jonathan's sister's house, police arrived and Jonathan was arrested without incident. Jonathan explained his quote-unquote defense to the officers, telling them about the Jenny Jones show, the secret crush reveal, and then the note that was left on the construction line outside of his house. Which, the way that Jonathan is just so gung-ho about pulling out cash, buying this big-ass buckshot gun, and then driving over to Scott's house, this makes me think that there was more to this than just the note. Maybe there were things that were said behind the scenes of the show that we don't know about. We also have no idea what was said during that dinner after the show. We don't know what Jonathan's friends and family members had been saying about the show since the taping. We just don't know. And we do know that his family is super homophobic. With all that, though, a note seems like a super weird thing to just decide to kill someone over. But I don't know. So this should have been like a hook, line, and sinker kind of case, right? Jonathan planned ahead. He pulled out cash. He bought the gun. He bought the ammo. And he drove straight to Scott's house, shot him, and killed him. And then called police to let him know what he'd done and where they could find him. This case should have been a cakewalk during the trial, but let's see how it goes. Because the trial started on October 14th, 1996, where Jonathan was charged with first-degree murder. But almost immediately, the defense lets the court know that they plan to use what is called the gay panic defense. So I actually want to read you verbatim what the gay panic defense is and what its purpose is as far as being used in a trial. So get ready because this is absolutely insane. It says, quote, "The gay panic defense or homosexual advance defense is a strategy of legal defense which refers to a situation in which a heterosexual individual charged with a violent crime against a homosexual individual claims that they lost control and reacted violently because of an unwanted sexual advance that was made upon them." And I'm just not sure how this is still a thing, but it is. And this defense seems so much like a cop-out defense that I'm amazed at the amount of states that still allow this defense to be used in a courtroom at all. There are just so many other things that you could use as a defense that would accomplish the same outcome without having to bring anyone's sexuality or sexual orientation into the courtroom at all. You could use sexual harassment, regular harassment, stalking, etc. This was a huge defense used in the 90s, and this case just so happened to take place in the 90s. Now, the defense did also say that Jonathan suffered from mental illness and that he suffered from things like manic depression and Graves' disease. Which, Graves' disease is an immune system disorder that results in the overproduction of thyroid hormones. And the defense was making sure that everyone knew and was aware of the fact that Graves' disease, which is what Jonathan suffered from, some of those symptoms were irritability and irrational and sometimes violent behavior, which that's all true. But murder can't be okay no matter what the disease or its symptoms. The defense lets the court know that appearing on the Jenny Jones show for Scott to reveal his secret crush on Jonathan had made Jonathan extremely uncomfortable, which I get that. But that would have been embarrassing having someone reveal their crush to you on national TV for the world to see. I get that. It would have been embarrassing for anybody. So let me just say what Jonathan's defense team couldn't come right out and say because they were essentially just saying that Jonathan was straight, a homosexual man who was also homophobic. And when Scott took Jonathan onto the Jenny Jones show to reveal his secret crush, that Jonathan quote-unquote panicked and that the note was the last straw that pushed Jonathan his panic over the edge. But that Jonathan's Graves' disease also played a factor in the thought process that Jonathan was already going through because of his homophobia and his quote-unquote panic. Now, the prosecution pointed out the fact that Jonathan had multiple different times throughout this thought process to stop this plan, to stop this murder. Jonathan had at least 5 or 6 times that I can think of off the top of my head where he could have changed his mind and this outcome and he could have went back home. But he didn't. And even though Jonathan had confessed to the murder and his plan to carry out the murder 2 different times, neither the written confession that he made or the verbal confession that he made were allowed to be used during the trial. And that's because the police didn't read Jonathan his Miranda rights before one of those confessions were made, And the second confession had been made before Jonathan had been given the right to effective counsel, which also that ties into being read your Miranda rights as well. So both of the confessions were essentially useless. And there was the matter of the chair that had been found overturned next to Scott's body, because according to the prosecution, that chair had been used as a way for, or means for Scott to, defend himself. But, of course, the defense fired back, saying that Jonathan only fired the 2 shots at Scott because he had thrown a chair at Jonathan. Which, I don't know. If someone came through my front door with a gun, I'm probably throwing shit too. But the chair and who had used it and why was kind of like the jury being stuck between a rock and a hard place. It didn't help that Jonathan did have Graves' disease, which does alter your mood and your reasoning. But then again, if Scott did throw the chair before Jonathan shot him, then could the shooting be used as a self-defense strategy? And Scott's roommate wasn't actually in the room when all of this went down, so he wouldn't be able to say for sure one way or another. But then there were a few people that came forward and testified that kind of put a twist in this case. There were a few people that came forward and testified that the day after the taping of the Jenny Jones show, that Scott and Jonathan had shared a mutual sexual advancement together. And there's no way to know if this is true or not, but there have also been rumors that the 2 men slept together, which this may or may not have happened. But I just feel like maybe whatever was said over dinner right after the show, maybe the 2 men were getting along really well, and maybe they did end up sleeping together. And then there's also another option that I could see happening. Maybe they all go to dinner, and maybe things weren't weird, and the men just decided to remain friends. But then maybe Scott felt like, being on the show had made them closer, even if it was just as friends, and then maybe Scott thought that it would be okay and even funny to put that note on Jonathan's light. We just don't know either way. But this is kind of what I mean when I said I'd like to know what happened after the show and while they were eating dinner after the show, after the taping of the show. Did Scott and Jonathan laugh about it and then, everything was fine? And then maybe Jonathan got home and he was telling his family and his parents about what had happened on the show. And maybe Jonathan wasn't expecting the homophobic things that his dad had to say. Also, because at this point, the show had not been canceled from airing. It was later canceled, but at this time it was still set to air. So maybe Jonathan got a bunch of shit from his dad after the taping of the show, and then maybe he started to realize that once that segment aired, that everybody would see the fantasies that Scott had been talking about, along with all the things that were said on the show, and then maybe leaving the house and Jonathan seeing that note is just what sent him over the edge. Because Jonathan's dad did take the stand during the trial. And it was very clear that he was homophobic and that he had raised his kids to be homophobic as well, while they were still young. And at one point, Jonathan's dad was asked a question, and he was still on the stand, and his dad just blurted out, "Well, how would you feel if someone thought you were gay?" Okay. And it was learned, though, that Jonathan had been told before agreeing to even appear on the Jenny Jones show that his secret crush was a female. So, how you gonna lie to somebody just to get them to come on your show, first of all? And Jenny Jones herself was even brought into the trial to testify. And of course she felt like she wasn't responsible for anything that had happened. I don't even think she held herself accountable for any part of this case. Even still to this day, I don't think she's held herself accountable. Because even though the murder is 100% Jonathan's fault and Jonathan's responsibility, you also have to kind of look at it like none of this would have even happened had it not been for the Jenny Jones show. So, it's just it's hard, but it's not. When the jury returned with their verdict, Jonathan was convicted on charges of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison and a maximum sentence of 50 years in prison. Now, after the verdict and the sentencing, Jonathan and his attorneys sued the Jenny Jones show, and Jonathan's attorneys advised him to go ahead and use all of his appeals. And surprisingly, Jonathan's verdict was overturned, and he was able to be retried. But after the retrial, Jonathan ended up getting the same verdict with the same sentence as he did the first go-round. And both Scott's family and Jonathan's family both agreed that this murder never would have happened had it not been for the Jenny Jones show and the ambush attack and their secret crush segments. This case also shined a light on the fact that these types of talk shows didn't do any sort of mental health wellness checkups on any of their guests, because even if they had done just a quick check, then the show would have known about Jonathan's Graves' disease and his manic depression. Maybe that would have changed the outcome. Now, in 1999, Scott's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Jenny Jones show, but of course, Jenny Jones still refused to take any accountability at all. The Jenny Jones show has never even so much as apologized to Scott's family, and she's even written a book about this murder where, of course, Jenny Jones made profit off of those book sales. Now, as far as the wrongful death suit was concerned, the jury came back and said that the Jenny Jones show and the producers of the show were going to have to pay Scott's family $29 million. No shock here, Scott's family never saw one red cent from this ruling. The verdict was appealed over and over and over again, and eventually, in 2002, the Michigan State Court ended up throwing out the original ruling that said that Scott's family would receive $29 million, and the ruling that Jenny Jones and the producers of the show were partly responsible for Scott's death. This new ruling found that the Jenny Jones show had no obligation to check on the show's guest after the taping and after the show was done. But even with the verdict being overturned for Scott's family, the Jenny Jones show and its ratings went completely downhill after Scott's murder, and finally the show was canceled in 2003. Now, the next update in this case was Jonathan being released from prison in 2017 after he served 22 years of his sentence, and he was let out for good behavior at the age of 42. Since Jonathan's release, I haven't seen or heard anything else about him, and I realize that I've kind of been playing devil's advocate for this entire episode, but don't misunderstand me and the fact that Scott was murdered and Jonathan is the one responsible. That is all I have for you this week. If you want more episodes, you can find those on Patreon. Don't forget to leave a review. Also, if you listen on Apple Podcast, make sure you're still subscribed. I've been seeing some stuff about if you don't listen to the show within like a 2-week period, they automatically unsubscribe you. So just check that. Go leave a review, go join Patreon, do all the things, share the show. I love you. Let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.